Hey, how's it going?
Hey, I'm very sorry. No, 6:30 in the morning,
Oh, wow.
so
Gosh.
I'm just grabbing a quick bite to eat.
No worries. It's totally fine. Where are you based? So you're based somewhere in Asia, is that right? Like in
Yeah,
what's
Taiwan.
8 hours? Taiwan. Okay, yeah.
Hmm.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and where
Cool.
are you?
UK. UK. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought you had said. But you're American?
I'm Scottish actually, but I've lived in America.
Oh,
I've
okay.
lived all over. And I've got this
Oh,
weird
okay.
quasi accent. And then most of the people I work with are in America. I'm sure you know some of that,
Hmm.
like a lot of people coming out of kind of Christianity.
Yeah, so that's kind of your audience is over in America.
A lot. Yeah, 60, 70%,
Yeah.
I'd say.
Oh,
So
okay.
a good chunk. And the rest are, I don't even know. I don't keep track of these things as well. It's probably shifted over the years, but yeah. I think the thing is with me being in Europe, I think Europe, they had their mass shift away from Christianity decades ago, and it
Right.
just,
Hmm.
still people are doing it, but there's just not that many people in Christianity who are shifting. Um,
Hmm.
Whereas in America, I mean, everyone and their mom still is on some level Christian. There's still a
Yes.
kind
Yeah.
of tendency or an obligation or whatever. And
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
people coming out of that is a much bigger deal. In the UK, you start leaving church and maybe some of your friends are a bit like, oh, whatever. But on
Yeah.
the whole, it's not that
Yeah.
big a culture shock. Plenty of people don't do it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a big
And
factor.
I mean, I wonder if Americans could learn from what happened then. Like
You'd
it would
wonder.
be
There's
interesting.
so many books on it. Like, there's some like
Really?
really interesting. There's a sociologist called Stuart Murray, and he
Uh-huh.
studies post Christendom societies. So he's got a really good
Yeah.
book called, I think it's called Post Christendom, and it basically looks at Europe and
Hmm.
says you've got this culture that is still Christian, but like
Yeah.
the people aren't really ascribing to that. In fact, you have people that are kids today in Europe don't even know Bible stories. You tell kids that are six, like Noah's Ark, and they're like, what?
Right.
Whereas like
Yeah.
20,
Yeah.
30 years ago, or you go into America and talk about Noah's Ark, it doesn't matter. Like everyone has heard of that story and knows it.
Yes.
And so he's like,
Yeah.
if anything, Christians have this like beautiful opportunity where they get to actually evangelize to people that have never heard the story. If Christians engaged with that concept and engaged with like the
Mm.
opportunity, whatever
Hmm.
people believe about Christianity, I don't know whether I'd be particularly excited about evangelizing or anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
but certainly like it's kind of a new concept of what Christianity can
Yeah.
look like, how it can engage with people. And so he's got some really interesting stuff about that. And I think it speaks a lot to how Christians failed to transition well and how Christians
Mm.
failed to kind of go, people are leaving because of what? Oh, that? Maybe we could adapt. And just that rigidness actually caused a
Mm.
lot of people to leave that probably wouldn't have left otherwise. You see that
Yeah.
the amount of people I talk to day in, day out that like, oh, I left because they weren't LGBT affirming. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
is that it though? Because you probably
Yeah.
could have found a progressive church somewhere or something,
Yeah.
maybe if there was
Yeah.
more churches being willing to be a bit more, progressive,
Yeah.
you wouldn't see so
Yeah.
many people leaving or who
It's
knows.
interesting, when I first was kind of breaking away from it, I went to this church that was gay affirming
Mm.
nearby. And I walked in there and it was very clearly, they got rainbow flags and I think the pastors were lesbians, but everything else is the same. Like they were
Mm-hmm.
singing the same
Yeah.
songs, the same order of service. And I was like, no,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
not okay. I was done with that kind of environment. And it was interesting at the time. I was like, so it isn't just the gay affirming thing that I'm
Mm.
walking away from.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
It's
that's
it's
really
amazing the
interesting.
different cracks that appear in people's like kind of framework, and they go, "Oh, that's my issue," or they have a gay
Hmm.
son, or they their loved one died and they didn't get saved, but they're like, "There's no way they're burning forever," or whatever it is. But then
Yeah.
as they actually start to find communities that don't believe that, suddenly they're like,
Hmm.
yeah, but really, we still believe this, or you're still
Hmm.
doing that, or really, we think it's a guy in the sky? Like, what's
Hmm.
that? Or whatever.
Yeah.
It is really fascinating how, yeah, it feels like once there's a crack, once there's something there that allows us to start exploring, suddenly we start
Yeah.
seeing everything with that lens. It's not just a few
Yeah.
things. But then obviously
Right.
not for a lot of people, right? I mean, some people
That's right.
love a progressive church with the lesbian couple
Yes.
leading it, and
they
they don't
love it.
go, oh yeah, that's fine. We're cool with penal substitution or eternal conscious.
Yeah,
or,
I know. I saw this tweet. Someone said that they've, deconstruct or whatever, but they still feel that like it still brings them to tears to hear that song "Shout to the Lord." The Hill song. I don't know if you know that song. It was
I know that song.
Yeah. And I was like, are you seriously? Because that does not move me at all.
Yeah. If it moves me to tears for very different reasons.
Yeah. But, I believe him when he says this, that it moves him to tears. And even though he's walked, but it was very hard to relate.
It's so funny, isn't it? It's weird. I guess it's personality components. And then I guess everyone's just different, what they need and the things that they need to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to have a framework to feel that they exist on a spinning rock hurtling through space. We kind of need something to help us feel like we're not just a collection of atoms that has some form of consciousness or whatever. But it's weird. Worship music, not for me. That's not the one. I don't know what it is for a lot of people, but that does not tick my box. But I know people that are like, I don't even believe in God anymore, but I put worship music on in the background just to kind of chill out. And I'm like, God, I'd be triggered to hell. I didn't like worship music when I was at church.
Yeah.
So, that's so funny. I'm so excited you're doing this. This is really great. I'll probably just include all of this anyway.
Time.
Oh, it's fine. It's great.
Yeah.
Things come and go and things happen. And so it's not a problem.
Yeah.
I'm very flexible. And so this is all I really do. This and chat to people. So I'm the definition of flexible. So yeah.
Great.
But
I was watching your stories with the when people answering people's questions. You did a really good job.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You get
it's a
lost.
tough dynamic. I get a lot of
Q&A. I feel like if I do a Q&A, I get crickets.
There's this fear I have though. Like I spent a long time not wanting to do things like that, Q&A or Instagram Live or things, because I'm like, if no one comes on, how awkward is it going to be? And I'm like, do I create like fake questions that I answer? And I'll be like, someone asked me this earlier in a message, and I'll start with those, And I'm paranoid, and then it always seems to work out. Like even if it's like 10 people coming on live, like it's great conversation, or even if I get like 4 or 5 questions on thingy. But I think I do a Q&A every single Wednesday now.
The consistency.
I've not the last couple of weeks because of just things with the election and stuff. I was like, I just don't feel like people need that in their feed. Maybe we needed that in our feed and not everything else we were getting. But I think consistency probably helps, because people then they bottle up their questions. I still get them every day in messages and stuff, but it feels like people know like, there's a Q&A. I'll save up a question for that.
Yeah. But, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your answers too. So
it's a weird one, because I don't know about you, because I don't know much about you. I have to be honest, because I've heard about you nonstop. Like people mention you, but they always mention you in the context of like parenting. And me and my wife don't have kids. That's definitely in our future, but it's not right now. So I'm like, I have enough books to read. I have enough podcasts to listen to. I'm like, parenting ones? That's on the back burner, right? I'll pick up some of those once we get pregnant or something like that. I'll start cramming. I've got 9 months. But like, so I just never even kind of thought like, I'm not even going to. And then I think it was it was a couple of weeks ago, whenever I messaged you and someone had asked like, who do you recommend for parenting stuff? And I was like, I'm sure I've heard a couple of names. Can't think of anyone off the top of my head. And I was like, who do other people recommend? And do you know what? I got like, I think 2 recommendations. I think they recommended someone else like once. And then I got like 30 people recommending you. And I was like, I should probably have her on to talk. So I'm excited, but I don't really know much about you at all. So that's my precursor. So I am apologetic in that if I ask you the most obvious, like you're like, everyone knows this about me, Phil. Please forgive me. Because I do not know much about your journey or anything. And so maybe we can start there and kind of maybe a little bit of like who you are and how you got to where you are now, and then we can kind of take it from wherever. This is very relaxed, very chill. What kind of time frame do you have? Like, how are you good? You're 6:30 in the morning. Gosh.
Yeah. So now it's 6:40. I'm a morning person though, so I'm okay to get up.
Okay, that's good.
I'm ready to go. Yeah.
I'm the opposite. So I mean, it's like, almost 11 here, but I often go into like 3 in the morning. I'm talking to people on podcasts and stuff. So
opposite
ends.
Yeah, if I were in your time, I would be the worst guest you could ever get.
Seriously, it'd be a nightmare, right? Yeah.
I go to bed very early and I'm just done.
That's funny. Cool.
Okay,
are you good for time then, Nia?
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Because you told me that you do long podcasts, right?
I do. So they usually, the short end is about an hour and a half. But they can go longer. I want to be really careful of like whatever time you have. So like if you give me look, this is my absolute, I need to be gone by then. We'll definitely stay within that.
So I had set out kind of 2 hours. So 6:30 to 8:30. So
let's try and wrap it by then for sure. So I need to watch because I can talk, and usually most people I have come on, they can talk too. And so we'll have lots to cover. But why don't we start by diving into like, who is Cindy? Like, how did you get to where you are today? Like, I'm assuming almost everyone I talk to at some point started within the confines of some sort of religion.
Yes.
And you are now here on the other side, helping people that have, you know, their own kind of religious trauma backgrounds and fundamental backgrounds, breaking free of that, raising kids. But how did we get there? Right. Like, what happened?
Yeah. No, I mean, for someone who says you don't know me very well, you captured it really well. I was just looking at this, you know, what's your 30-second elevator pitch for your podcast, which my podcast is called Parenting Forward. And I was thinking, oh, it's so easy. So my podcast is helping parents recover from religious trauma so that they can raise their kids for a better life, right? And so my name is Cindy Wang Brandt, and I am speaking to you from Taiwan. I was born and raised here. I was born into an irreligious family. So I actually didn't start out in religion. But my family immigrated overseas. And when we came back, my parents didn't want to put me in the local school system. And so they put me in the school that was started by conservative evangelical missionaries in Taiwan.
Okay.
And, you know, the school was founded to serve missionary kids, but they also accept local kids. So I was considered a local kid. And
a local kid in with all the missionary kids.
That's right.
You were doomed, right?
Well, like when I was there, so in my generation, it was more like 50-50. There were 50% missionary kids, 50% local kids. Now, my kids go to that school too, but now it's more like 90% local kids because missionaries are dwindling here in Taiwan. So, I mean, I don't even know if there's 10% missionary kids. It's more like 5%. So it's kind of overwhelmingly secular in terms of the student body. Anyway, so at that time I was converted. So I was converted by missionaries, and I was about 12 years old. And then I sort of spent my adolescent formation days in evangelicalism. And, you know, it was pretty immersive because for an international school, we kind of are in our own little bubble, right? Because we don't quite fit in with the local schools. And so within that bubble, we had chapels, we had Bible studies, we had the, you know, short-term missions trips. And so I was very immersed in that environment. And it was a very impressive formation time for me. So even though I wasn't born into a religious family, it really feels like I grew up in it. Right. And I was very devoted. I was very serious about my faith. And I ended up going to a Christian college, which was a big step for me coming from a religious family, right? But I made that choice. When I was going to college, I went to a Christian college. I went to Wheaton College, and then I went to Fuller Seminary, and then I actually became a missionary myself. And I did that for 5.5 years, along with my husband. So, and then, you know, people like the neat story of I became a Christian and I was in this, and then I started deconstructing, but really, you know, the journey of going into religion and coming out of religion, all of that, this whole journey I call it a process of figuring stuff out.
Absolutely.
And if you look at my journey, I've been figuring stuff out for a long time, even as a kid and as an adolescent and as a young adult. I was always figuring stuff out. But I guess on the surface, on an institutional level, I began to start pushing away from that construct of my adolescence as I moved out of the mission field. So maybe in my 30s was when I began to be outspoken about leaving that world. I mean, even at the time, I wouldn't have called it leaving because I was afraid to leave, which is part of the design, to make you afraid to leave. But that's what I was doing. I was starting the process of leaving. And so that's how I spent my 30s. And then at the same time, I became a parent. So I was starting to figure out, well, how am I supposed to raise my kids when I am figuring all the stuff out, very confused and anxious and, filled with all these feelings of like regret and betrayal and all of these things. How do I manage all those feelings? How do I figure out cognitively what my beliefs are? How do I do all of that really important work when I'm raising kids who are they're figuring stuff out at the same time, but at a different stage of their faith formation, right? So that's when I started to do work online and trying to find community support of other people who might be going through this. And that's how Parenting Forward started. I started a Facebook group called Raising Children Unfundamentalists, which is still going strong now. And eventually published Parenting Forward, the book. And now I have the podcast, and I have hosted 2 conferences, and I have one coming up called Parenting After Purity Culture. So I've just really invested in this work of helping other parents who are in my position, who've had to leave a whole worldview, and not necessarily leave, but like they're in that tumultuous process of shifting. And how are they going to, again, sort of manage all those feelings at the same time, being tasked with this responsibility of raising a new generation of little humans.
Yeah. Wow. It's quite the journey. Like you said, it's just figuring it out as we go. I don't know if we ever are not figuring it out. I think we like to, tell ourselves these stories and create these stories that give us a bit more stability. We feel like we're more static, but the truth is we probably are changing and morphing and adapting constantly. And then we fit it into our story to feel more static. But I think like, I can't even imagine. Like we just started dog sitting 2 days a week because I want a dog, and I'm like, I also know I shouldn't get a dog because I just have not got the time to commit to it and the finances and everything else. I'm just like, let's not get a dog. And I was like, let's dog sit 2 days a week. And after 2 weeks, I'm like, let's go down to 1 day a week. Like I just don't have the mental space, the time. It's a young puppy. It's like a lot of work. And I'm like, how am I going to survive with a child? Like it's so much going on. I cannot imagine doing that in the headspace of having existential crisis, grieving the loss of community, grieving the loss of God. Even if you still believe in God, the God you believed, you've lost that, maybe the relationship that you used to have or whatever, getting through the regret and the shame, all these different emotions that are flying around. I cannot imagine having another human being relying on me 24/7 whilst trying to just parent myself almost, it's exactly. So much to go through. Really is. You started a community, but you initially went online to kind of try and find some form of community. When you kind of went on, was there not really much going on in the online space of parenting around the concept of deconstructing, deconverting, that kind of stuff? Did you kind of walk in and go, holy crap, this is a niche?
I just was like, why isn't anyone else talking about this? To me, it was such a glaring problem that needed, I can't solve the problem, but it needed community. It needed support. And I really couldn't believe it. When you try to publish a book, they ask you to look for comparable titles. So other books that are like it. And I didn't feel like I found any. Right.
Wow.
And then also like the idea of parenting, especially in America, any kind of Christian faith parenting is saturated with conservative values, right?
Hugely,
I mean,
I'd
they're
imagine.
the family values party, right? So you've got James Dobson and and then his subsequent, like his, people who came after him, like focus on the family is still thriving.
It's crazy. It's wild.
Yeah. And so it's like overwhelmingly the support for parents are coming from the conservative faith voices. And I'm like, there are lots of amazing progressive faith voices. How come there's nothing on parenting? And so I guess I wanted to fill that need. And so that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there are 1,000 different directions we can go, and I'm sure you have different things that you're like, oh, well, we should talk about this. You know this field probably better than me, so please steer us if we get into weeds. But one of the things that fascinates me is in working with people that go through some form of deconstruction, or my camera's gone like really weird.
I'm like, has my eyes gotten worse? Have I aged?
Just like suddenly gone blind. I just switched off, so it's fine. It's fascinating as you work with people at Deconstruct because it can look like almost anything. You're going into the unknown, and there's so much opinion out there of what deconstruction looks like, right? You put out some article online and everyone comes to the surface to tell you what they think about deconstruction. But working in the area of research with deconstruction, which is part of what I do, I can tell you that it's not what people portray. Like, yes, some people go and fully deconvert and become an atheist, but a lot of people go into a lot more of a gray area, maybe agnosticism with a bit of Christian kind of blended in. Some people redefine their Christianity, they go into kind of a more progressive Christianity or something a little bit more gray, but in that world. Some people go into a more kind of spiritual thing and they term themselves, spiritual but not religious, or some other things. Yeah. There's so many different directions. And I guess to me, it's been challenging for me to take a step back and go, okay, I can't be to my spirituality. I have to take a step back and go, okay, what about your spirituality, and help guide people according to where they're at. And I guess, how did you navigate this concept of we're no longer fundamentalists?
That's right.
What we are is probably a very diverse and complex area. I just had a homeschooler on recently who is homeschooling her kids, but from a decolonized, deconstructed conception, which for homeschooling is generally very conservative.
That's right.
And she's like trying to process that. And I was asking the same question. I'm like, but are you still factoring it as your faith? Are you still doing the same kind of brainwashing? And I don't mean that in even a negative sense, but I just mean like creating a very rigid kind of paradigm around spirituality.
Right.
How do you avoid that? Like, is that something you're aware of and try and avoid? Or do you go, we all have our spirituality and it's probably good to instill that in our kids? Like, what's the way to handle that for people, especially when they're not maybe certain in what they believe at the time?
Well, I mean, you touched on this a little bit earlier when you said that we're all figuring out our place in this hurtling rock through space, right? And I think that it is universal that we as human beings are meaning makers. We all are trying to construct some kind of meaning about our lives and our purpose and all these things. And so I do make this claim that everyone is spiritual, because I think for me, spirituality is referring to that fundamental need to create meaning. And so I don't think that we have to be shy about owning that. I think we don't live in a vacuum of values and of stories and of constructs. I don't think it's possible. You can't step outside of that project of meaning making. And so I think being aware of this as parents, like, okay, well, then we are living some kind of story. Right. And my particular story is of this very profound faith shift. But it's only profound because of the constructs that society has put on. It's only profound because it's very glaring and obvious that I was part of this one institution and now that I've left. But we all are shifting in some way. We're all moving. We all have some kind of movement, and we all are trying to apply some kind of story to the way that we move through life and this world. And so I think for parents and for what I do, I tell people, well, don't be afraid to own it. Don't be afraid to own that you are creating some kind of meaning and you are sharing some kind of values with your kids. And I think the most important thing that I really try to focus on is that we have to give our children the autonomy to create their own story, to write their own story, to construct their own meaning. Because I think what was most harmful about my upbringing was that, you know, the robbing of my autonomy, right? That I was taught to not trust myself. I was trust that I was, that my desires were sinful. And that erosion of my autonomy was very abusive spiritually because I was robbed of my ability to create meaning for my own life. And that's right. Like I said, if that's the fundamental human need to construct meaning and you take that away from me, from a child, that is abusive. And so I think in the work that I do, I'm trying to say, this is what you don't do. You don't abuse a child spiritually, but then whatever happens after that, then it's up to the child. It's not even up to the parents, right? Our job is to give them the freedom and the power to forge their own path. And so yeah, I mean, we're doing two things at the same time. We're claiming and reclaiming our own power to write our own story and hopefully modeling that for the kids. And then we're also sort of creating the first story that they are going to live into and negotiate and renegotiate as well. But yeah, I'm very pleased because in my group, Raising Children on Fundamentalists, we have parents of all different faith persuasions. We have anything from atheists to, pagans to progressive Christians to, I mean, the only people I don't think we have too many of is maybe evangelical Christians, because I push back so often against that. I don't think they feel very welcome in there. But maybe some of them are there either hate following or they're genuine about exploring their own faith tradition, and they're able to handle my criticism of it. And if that's true, then good for them.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, absolutely. If they can handle it, it's probably speaks a lot to maybe some of their journey and where they're heading anyway. But yeah, no, that's really great. So what are the main kind of challenges if you were kind of to go, oh, these are the biggies, that are quite specific to parents that are deconstructing? What are the kind of oh crap, what does this mean from how I raise my kids, what that looks like? I mean, I hear a lot of things. I get a lot of questions. Usually I'm just now I'm go check out Parenting Forward or go check out someone else. But generally speaking, I'm hey, I have my areas of expertise. They're very niche. That is not one of them. Do not ask me. I don't know. But I hear the same questions and things like that. And so I'm intrigued, you must hear, overarching, kind of themes that people are struggling with. And what are those? And how do people start
they're probably not actually too different from the questions you get. The some of the most frequently asked questions and problems that people need solving is community. They've lost their community, and evangelicalism was really great for raising a family because they have something lined up for their kids. In the summer, they have VBS. During the year, they have potlucks and they have the Sunday school, and it's very well resourced. And there's a lot of money going to those programs. And there's a plethora of curriculum for people to use and engage, and they're fun and they're crafty and right. That's evangelicals do that really well. So for anyone who's leaving that, they're walking away from a whole structure of family life. And that's a big struggle. And so that's one challenge that people have. Another very common challenge is their relationship with grandparents. Because so many of them are trying to raise their kids in progressive values. They have, maybe no spanking and even very expansive notions of gender expression, and their grandparents can't handle it. So the parents' parents and the children's grandparents, right? And then navigating that during holidays. So that's also not maybe exclusive to parenting spaces, but it adds a little bit of extra stress because if you, right, have tension with your parents, you're going to have to try to explain that to their kids why they aren't going to their beloved grandparents' house this year. So there's that challenge. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's plenty to go in there, I guess. I mean, that second point is just absolutely massive because, I mean, the relational fallout, and I guess both of them really come down to relational fallout and community and but
that's right.
The dynamics of dealing with parents and just naturally the family that we come from is more than likely to not come with us and if we're escaping some form of faith, it's usually the faith of our family more often than not. And so like, but the problem with parents is, I mean, just disappointing your parents in general is a hard thing for a lot of people to navigate, especially in these religious concepts. There's so much honor your parents and all those kind of dynamics in play. Then there's the kind of patriarchal, even somewhat matriarchal components of like, well, whoever's up the top, they kind of dictate. They kind of do get to go, oh, well, you know, you shouldn't be doing that with your kids. And the right way to do it is this, or the wrong way to do it, and whatever. Like, there's a whole nother level of pressure as soon as you bring kids into play. And then the kid's not understanding. Like that's got to be tough as well, because how do you say to your kid, look, it's just a really toxic environment for you at grandpa and grandma's house. Like, that's a hard thing to explain to a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old. Like, how do people start going about like creating those boundaries and things that are required there? Like, do you recommend people to kind of just kind of draw the line and go, we can't do this? Or, I mean, how do people start dealing with very conservative grandparents and obviously parents for them? And
so I think I think you named the magic word as boundaries. Sorry, excuse me.
No, you're fine.
You know, they say you shouldn't drink coffee in the morning, that it doesn't help with your voice, but I'm like, I needed some coffee.
You're fine.
Do you edit? You edit?
I tend not to. It's fine. People, you know what? If people are listening to this and they don't want to listen to someone cough once in a while, they are not engaged. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure if they're engaged, they can plow through. But yeah. You can do or say or whatever you want. And I can edit as well if you do go, oh God, I shouldn't have mentioned that person or whatever.
Oh, okay.
If you go on a 5-minute coughing fit. If you need to go grab another drink or something, we can edit. So.
Oh, okay. So I think you named the magic concept, which is boundaries. And so we talk a lot about boundaries in our community because, and I think it's especially challenging for those of us who grew up evangelical or in religiously conservative environments, because boundaries were not honored and we never learned how to even draw them. We don't even know how to recognize what boundaries are. So people, like recently someone asked me, when do we draw a boundary and when do we just disengage with regards to grandparents, or parents? And I'm like, see, even that question betrays that you don't understand what boundaries are, because disengaging is a boundary. That is a way of drawing a boundary. So we don't even have, like, it's like we have to go back to Boundaries 101, and we have to go back and reparent ourselves and learning what boundaries are and what it means to make them. Because, right, like I said, the theologies and the ideologies and the culture in that environment just didn't foster that. We never learned. And so I feel like that's the key to managing a lot of these relationships, both with finding new communities or leaving old communities and managing relationships, because it's all about what it means to sort of become comfortable with what you're okay with and what you're not okay with, which is like the definition of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
So learning that about yourself and then owning that, like truly embracing it and being like, this is what I'm okay with. This is what I'm not okay with. And I just really believe that if you come to the space of being comfortable with that, then it's a lot easier in terms of drawing boundaries, in terms of making decisions about whether or not you want to engage or you want to disengage or you want to ghost or you want to leave a community and go to another community. Because it's not, it doesn't become this dramatic showdown, right? It simply is being who you are in whatever space you're in.
Yeah.
And it's not near as reactive. It's just, hey, this is how we're gonna do it. This is what I'm okay with. This is what I'm not okay with, right? Like you can simply state your boundaries, and you can do it in kindness and love and compassion and curiosity, instead of I'm cutting you out of my life, right? Which is
absolutely.
It sounds like a strong boundary being drawn, but I think for somebody, when people cut someone out of their lives in a very angry, reactionary way, it actually shows that they're still learning to draw a boundary. Because I think healthy boundary drawing is not done out of anxiety, but out of security.
Yeah, no, that's huge. I think that betrays as well how we're brought up in some of these kind of more fundamental kind of concepts of faith, is that we don't really learn to have autonomy. We do look to the authority figure to dictate how we should operate, how we should relate to others, and even relate to the authority figure. And I guess that just has this cyclical knock-on effect, right? So we can't do it, and then God knows if our kids will ever learn to do it if we can't learn, and so on and so forth, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I guess, like you said, it betrays this like insecurity, acting out of fear, not really being confident in ourselves, not having that autonomy, and going, oh no, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I need some space. And
that's right.
You're welcome to come back in. But there's like, I always kind of try and say like, it feels like a lot of, I've been around a lot of evangelicals that talk about boundaries and teach boundaries, but it feels like boundaries in those contexts are always taught as this kind of punishment mechanism. And it's really weird and warped. And to me, like that shouldn't be how we set up our boundaries. I think that's certainly early stages how a lot of people do end up setting up their boundaries when they deconstruct, and they have to kind of just go no, and there is a lashback or I have to disconnect or whatever. But there should be some concept of like, hey, here I'm putting up a fence. There's a gate here. On the gate are some rules. When you're able to fulfill those, I really want you on the other side of this fence, but you're not coming across until you tick the boxes on the gate. And I think that requires a whole level of working in ourselves, I guess. And do you find that reparenting oneself is a big component of this as well? Then it's not just really.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like, you know, in this project to parent forward, I often say we don't want to change our children. We don't want to control our children. That's the opposite of what we're doing. But there is one thing that we can change, which is ourselves, right? So like we, you know, in parenting spaces, you're like, you want to raise kind children and children with justice and compassionate children. And those are all very good things, but we can't ultimately apply character to our kids. They're not robots that we can design. We can't input what the protocol of who we want them to be, because they're humans and they have this freedom to choose, and they have the freedom to choose things we don't like. But there are things that we can do to change ourselves and to create a loving environment. And so, a big part of that is reparenting ourselves. So raising children on fundamentalists is about dismantling and relearning some of the things that we didn't learn when we were raised fundamentalists. And hopefully the process of doing that results in, you know, treating our children better and giving them a model for being able to change. Like, I think it's a really important work that we're doing is showing our children that they can change their minds. I feel like that's actually kind of a benefit of people who are faith shifting, because, you know, maybe kids who are growing up in families that are already very progressive, maybe they don't get to see that. But I know my kids have seen that we've changed. And I just think that's a really important lesson for kids to learn, is that they can also change. They can change their minds. They can change their lives. They can change the decisions that they've made for themselves. Like that's what being human is. We're always growing and moving.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's huge. I mean, that points to me to a different world. Like if there's one thing that, not one thing, it's just a big thing, I guess. But like you look at the way the world is operating right now and the way we interact with people around us, it feels like our inability to admit that we were wrong at some point and might have to change and will change our opinion and maybe go, oh, that person over there that I disagreed with yesterday, I now agree with, and I don't feel embarrassed. I don't feel shame about it. Because that's really what stops us kind of changing our mind, right? With rigidity, pride, and I'm right, you're wrong. I'm in the in group, you're in the out group. But this concept of seeing that modeled for us, someone going, hey, this was what was right for me yesterday, and I'm now realizing it's not right, and that's okay. It's not we don't have to be shamed about it. We don't have to be upset about it. We can just go, oh, great, we've changed, we've moved. Like, that feels like a generational shift, because I don't see that modeled even outside of religion, to be honest with you. It feels like that's a very, I don't know, deeply ingrained thing.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what exactly feeds into that, because I still struggle with it till this day. Just like I have this big fear of being flaky. Like I don't want people to perceive me as flaky and as changing my mind. I mean, I think conservative cultures tend to be more static, right? They tend to want to preserve the status quo. Yeah. And so maybe my years of growing up in that just reinforced this fear of like, oh no, you stick to, and then maybe the Protestant work ethic as well. Like you don't quit, right?
Yeah.
You stick with what you've committed to and you don't quit. Yeah. And so I definitely have that in me. So yeah. I love the practice of reevaluating, right?
Yeah.
You can always reevaluate. So trying something and saying, okay, well, we're going to reevaluate in a few months or a few weeks or a few years has been a helpful practice for me, because I think it allows me to be more willing to take risks and try different projects or try doing different things, because I don't have to necessarily commit to it. I can just try it and then reevaluate.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's amazing. Some of these things you're mentioning, it feels like a lot of them are holdovers from certain components of faith, but specifically even concepts within our theology, our view of God almost, I guess, the way I see it is, generally speaking, our leadership in church, for example, will tend to look like God. And so, or the version of God they believe in. And then how we're to interact with our leadership is almost how we're to interact with how they're supposed to interact with God. There's this kind of like, you look like the God you worship almost. And I guess what I've seen and observed, and again, from the outside as not a parent, maybe as a kid, I've observed this even maybe, is parenting often reflects how we conceive the way we're supposed to relate to God almost. There's this like microcosm of, we are the God of our little family. And so there's this God who loves you, but is still going to punish you if you're not right, or if you're not holy, or if you're not, in right standing. Or
well, I mean,
these kind of different ideas.
In evangelicalism, that's made explicit. You take on the role of discipline, just as God disciplines us, we have to discipline our kids. Like, that's not even subtle. So essentially parents become the gods of their children. And it's horrible, because that God is authoritarian. And so then you become authoritarian parents to your kids, which is very harmful, and not at all the best way to raise children. So yeah, it's not subtle at all. That's the plan. That's the design, that you act that way. And it's terrible, because we shouldn't, it's just extremely arrogant to think that we can be God. And for anyone who has a healthy expression of who God is, God should be love and loving and not mediated by punishment. It's that really abusive notion that love feels like pain, right? Like when parents, a lot of times when they maybe spank their kids, they say, I'm doing this out of love. And in
the whole, this hurts me more than you, or all these kind of things that we say.
And in conservative theologies, it's the same. It's like sometimes you go through hard times, but it's because God loves you, and God wants to, bring good things out of this very terrible tragedy in your life. And so it's always this equating of love with pain and suffering. It's the redemptive suffering, right? And it's very confusing for a child, right?
Yeah.
It's a distortion of what love is. Love shouldn't feel like pain. Love should feel like love.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very distorted. I don't know. I've moved away from that kind of thinking for so long. It's hard for me to even remember that that's how people parent. But certainly in what I try to promote, we don't act like gods to our children. We want our children to trust themselves, to learn to develop a way of intrinsically motivating themselves. We want them, of course, to do good in this world, to be good in this world, but there's this trust that they would, if we pour in love. I think they're going to mirror, right, what they see. And so much of, right, crime or misbehavior comes out of toxic wounds of childhood. And so if we can actively try to not harm our children, that goes a long ways into fixing some of the social problems that we have in society. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that you talk about not reading my book because it's a parenting book, but and not that I'm trying to sell you my book, but I always try to say that for anyone who has like a desire and heart for social justice and for creating a better world, like the parenting space is very important, because not just for parents, because I think we can fix so many of our big problems if we can learn to treat children better, to learn to treat this next generation in a better way for the hope of a better society. And that it's not just parents that need to do that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I remember there was a book years ago when I was in much more kind of evangelical fundamental world. There was a book that I absolutely loved, and it was a parenting book. And someone had given it to me, and I read it. I don't know why. And it was teaching very kind of progressive views in a lot of ways, considering it was a Christian book. But it was talking about giving kids autonomy, giving them like healthy choices, like, giving them great deals of freedom, treating them like a human being, not just, my property that I'm at some point going to have to come to terms with, gets to have its own life. And people frequently ask me what my favorite book on leadership was. And I would recommend this book, this parenting book, because I was like, honestly, if you can get that I have to treat a 2-year-old like this, you should really get that I should probably teach other people in my church or my leadership team like this. Like, if people struggle to handle this as a parenting, as a how to deal with kids, but honestly, we don't treat other adults as though they have autonomy a lot of time, right? We treat people like pawns most of the time, or we try and control and manipulate, and we get upset when they don't do what we want and whatever it is. And I just think, like, gosh, what a different way to engage with the world, and even like
that's such a good
social
point.
Justice and
that's a really good point, because I feel like a lot of people who have broken away from kind of a toxic religious background, they're very wary of leadership, because they for so long they had to submit to this authority that was harmful to them. And so they become dissenters, right? Like, we just want to dissent. But the reality is, you can't really have a healthy, thriving culture without solid leadership. It just doesn't happen, because good leadership provides vision. It provides a safe space. They provide cohesiveness, right? And without cohesiveness, you don't have movement and energy. So if you look at the elections, like what turned Georgia blue, Stacey Abrams provided this leadership and galvanized people and mobilizing. Like, you can't get things done, right, without some kind of leadership. And so absolutely. I think we have to embrace that. We have to understand that leadership is necessary. But of course, right, we don't want to repeat the hierarchical authoritarian leadership. We want healthy leadership. And I think you're right that parenting is a model for that, because we also don't want to be permissive parents where we just kind of let our kids do whatever they want to. That's not very loving, right? But the loving thing to do is to provide those boundaries and to give them a sense of grounding and security. And at the same time, giving them power and autonomy. And I think that's what healthy leadership should look like. Like any leader who is seeking to give power to you, that's a good leader. Any leader that's trying to take power away from you is authoritarian, right? And so, I do appreciate that comparison of parenting with leadership. It's a good
I guess something that fascinates me is kids. I mean, when you look at something like psychological development, kids go through different stages where they need remarkably different things. You look at what a toddler needs to survive in this world just from a psychological perspective, just to feel safe, just to feel whatever it needs, to a 7-year-old, to a 16-year-old. Those are radically different stages where you're probably going to want to give a 16-year-old a lot more autonomy than a toddler. But you still want this toddler to feel like it has autonomy and genuinely have autonomy, but at the same time go, okay, but I need to create some boundaries for it, some structure.
Right.
A 7-year-old wants a lot more certainty, whereas a 16-year-old, you might feel a bit more comfortable going like, I don't know. None of us really know. You say that to like a 7-year-old that's looking for meaning, probably needs a bit more meaning. Like, how do you navigate like balancing that, understanding what you're, because I guess every kid's different on some level. They all have kind of this general growth that kids kind of navigate, but they all do it so uniquely. Like, how do you go about as a parent navigating this? Because a lot of people, the default is, certainly if they come from fundamental, is like, well, we just tell them what it is and we yell at them until they do it the way we do it, and we set up fixed rules.
Because I said so.
Doesn't matter whether you're 2 or you're 17. Because I said so, this is the rules, from the 2-year-old wanting to get a glass of milk by itself right through to the 17-year-old wanting to go out with their boyfriend for the evening, right? It's still, here's the rules. This is what I demand from you. Obviously, there's kind of a whole dynamic there of figuring out how to do that as a parent well. And there probably is structure still needed and things at different ages.
Yeah. So there's several things I would say to that. First of all, I do think we have to disrupt some of these age constructs. I feel like a lot of the age constructs have been really a result of capitalism. When toy makers wanted to sell toys to more people, they set up these ages of like, okay, these are toys for 3 to 5-year-olds, preschool toys. And then when you turn 5, then you have to go to school, school age, 5 to 11, whatever. And these constructs came about because of corporations trying to sell you stuff. And so I do think we need to disrupt that because, like you said, every child is different. And I think any parent who's had to potty train a child know that they are ready when they're ready, not necessarily because there's a timeline of when they're ready. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. There are 17-year-olds that are still quite immature. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just their brains haven't developed quite yet. And then there are 6-year-olds who are remarkably sophisticated, just because every person and every child is unique. So I would keep that in mind to not assume that kids should act a certain way. Like, for instance, I was never a rebellious teenager, right? But that's the assumption that we make of teenagers, that, teenagers are rebellious. And I just wasn't. And that's just my development. So that's one thing. Having said that, there are I think we have to use some of those developmental research as a resource for us as parents, right? Like, we rely on the research of sociologists and parenting experts who do observe these general developmental needs. like you said, a 2-year-old doesn't have the motor skills to maybe pour herself milk quite yet. And so, yeah, taking into the consideration of this research, we do understand the different needs. And I think investing in knowing that is helpful when we engage our kids. And I think when it comes to, I mainly talk about like faith formation, right? And spirituality with our kids. Like there are different needs. So like you said, a 7-year-old might need a lot of certainty. They just want to know where we go when we die. They don't want like, well, we don't actually know.
There's the 13 different theories.
Yeah, exactly. So what we talk a lot about in my community is the concept of scaffolding, right? So instead of saying, giving kids certain answers and then saying this is the final answer, we kind of prepare them for the more nuanced conversations when they're ready. And yeah, I mean, the practicalities of doing that it could be difficult, but it really depends on like who your child is and the kind of relationship that we have with your child. But it's like, don't just tell them, so if somebody does ask about death, like where do we go when we go to heaven? Don't just give them the certain answer and leave it at that, right? Like prepare them for the more nuanced conversations of when they are older. And
what does that look like? So when you're talking about that, like I'm a 7 or 6 year old going, my grandmother's died, and I'm going, so what? Where did she go? Like, is she going to go to? Does she go somewhere and live somewhere? Like,
so I think for me, if a kid asked that question, I would think about what is driving that question, And I think for some kids, it might be anxiety of their own death, right? And for other kids, it might be just a real sense of grief that they've lost this person that's special in their life. And for some, it might be intellectual curiosity. Some kids are just, have existential questions at a young age. And so I think you have to kind of look at the thing beneath the thing and address that. Instead of just giving them the doctrinal answer, like if you believe, grandma is in heaven, I just think that doesn't, it's weak. It's a weak answer because it's not satisfying the thing beneath the thing. Yeah. So for a child who's maybe anxious about their own death, I would maybe give the answer, grandma has had a very long life. This is not something that you need to be worried about right now. You're safe. You're loved. The chances of anything happening to you is very low. Right? Like I would try to fulfill that need. Now, if it's an intellectual question, then I would maybe talk about it in a scientific way. Like, oh, well, this is what happens to our bodies. Our hearts start beating and maybe go that direction. All, of course, in age appropriate ways and in ways that they can understand and accept. Sure. Right. So, I think I would encourage people to look at the thing beneath the thing. And that requires a lot of listening to your child. Right. To not a lot of parents, they jump to answering a child's question because they're so flustered and anxious about the question. But, maybe before you answer the question, ask a few more questions to figure out what is really driving the question asker. Yeah.
No, I think that's really insightful and quite beautiful as well. I think it opens up a whole level of connection with the child as well. That just isn't there when you just go, this is what's happening. I mean, of course, in something like that, you've just lost grandma. That means you've just lost mom, or, there's so much going on there that makes it a very hard thing to do anyway.
If it's the grief that's driving them, then I would really encourage validating that with your own emotions, right? Say, hey, listen, it's okay to be sad because I'm really sad too. And we can cry together, and here are ways that we can cope with our grief and giving them tools. Like these are all such valuable life lessons that moments like losing a loved one is just rich with opportunities to raise a human being. Because you're teaching them so many important lessons, right? Like validating emotion and giving them resources and tools for coping with sadness. all of these things. And so, as hard as these times are, they are kind of a prime time for cultivating spirituality, because our kids, I say all our kids are spiritual beings because I believe that, but we don't, just like the rest of us, we aren't always explicit about expressing our spirituality because we're busy with a lot of other things, at the activities of life. And so often it's like those moments before you go to bed. So that's why like the bedtime tuck-in routine is so precious, because a lot of times, I know for my kids, those are the times when they ask the deeper questions of life, when everything is still, when their mind can begin to slow down. And so yeah.
And then you go to your bed and lay awake all night going, what do I think about that? They give you the existential crisis before you go to bed. That's funny.
Yeah.
I love it. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me, I think earlier in the year, I was talking to a very young girl, like 7 years old, in the back of someone's car that was giving me a lift after I'd done some meetings. And she asked me about hell. And I was like, I guess she found out from her parents that I was there to talk about Jesus or something. I don't know. And she says, she asked me, it's like, what do you think about hell? And I was like, oh, like, that's weird. And I'm like, I'm not that experienced talking to kids. I mean, I don't have my own. I mean, talked to a few kids here and there, but, especially not in the midst of a pandemic.
How old was this girl?
Like 7, maybe 8, young,
okay.
But I guess, maybe looking at some of these things, but I think growing up in a Christian church, that kind of environment. But I kind of did feel like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the dad's sitting right there. I'm not going to touch that with a barge pole. I said, so what do you think about how, like, just asking the question. And it turns out like, oh, there's so much more to this question, where she took what she was thinking about hell and the questions it was given her. I'm like, whoa, like you're doing some really existential kind of like questioning of like, who are we? Why are we here? What goes on after we die? What is the nature of God? Like all that stuff was packed into this one question that I could imagine very easily. I'm sure parents would have given a great answer and gone into depth as well. Great parents. But I can imagine many parents would just go, oh, that's where you go if you don't know Jesus. And that would be the end of the conversation. Like that's a much easier, simple, controlled answer, but it doesn't really answer the question because there's a whole bunch more to it, if you're willing to ask the question, I guess. And so, that's why I love that answer, the going beyond the actual, surface kind of question, going beyond the surface stuff. It's so huge.
Speaking of hell, I just read this article about this planet that like is like a literal hell. It's like very high temperatures and degrees. And I was like, oh, well, hell does exist.
We just need a lot better space technology to get there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the story of you talking to this girl is really poignant because I think for people, especially with religious trauma, I mean, hell is usually a big part of that trauma because a lot of us were traumatized with hell when we were kids and that stays in our bodies, right? And so a lot of times when kids bring up questions that could really be just out of curiosity and a place of healthy questioning, we react to it. We're like, oh, I have to debunk this idea right now. I can't have my children talking about hell at all. And that's, what you're doing is you're shutting down that curiosity and you're saying that it's not okay to ask questions. And so that's too bad. I don't want to judge parents who react that way because I have reacted that way myself. And it's understandable, but I think we have to remember that our kids are not us. They are not going to be traumatized in the same way, especially if they're growing up under our care, right?
Yeah.
And so to not react so quickly to their questions about these kinds of things, about Jesus, about hell, about salvation and all this stuff, but to like you said, first listen to what they're asking. What are they grappling with? And what's leading to this. Now, sometimes I know there are parents in my community who have reported that their kids come back from Sunday school or from childcare that's run by religious people, and they say things like, Mom, do you know that I have sin in my heart? And that's something that is a big red flag, because it's telling me that this child is internalizing this shame, right? And that, like I said, this spiritually abusive teaching. And so I think that is something to respond to.
Yeah.
Quite urgently, right? Because you want to
absolutely
protect your child from that kind of abuse.
Yeah. I mean, this brings up, I guess, so in your example, had you kind of started to deconstruct your faith before you had your kids, or as you were just having your kids? Your kids were very young and you were kind of already beginning. So I guess the question I have is, what do you do with kids that are older and you're wanting to instill that autonomy and that freedom, that have got a bit of background in church? Maybe they're 11, 12 and they've been going to church their whole life, and you go, I'm out. I'm done with this shit. It's toxic. It's horrible. I hate it. And yet they're like, but Mom, I love it here. And I do believe this stuff. And they can engage with this on some level intellectually, probably a lot more than most of us give people credit for at that kind of age. And yet there is a very real component of like, this is unhealthy, at least from my perspective, which I see as a more enlightened, evolved, wise, I've been there, done that view. But as an 11-year-old kid, just doing this and loving it and going, no, I really believe that there is a hell and I need to be this and there is sin and I need to try and be a good kid or pray to Jesus or whatever the things are. How do parents navigate that kind of stuff? You know, I mean, I guess it's different if they're young and they're in a Christian church school just occasionally and you're like, kind of like, yeah, but we don't really believe that. Or even that might be very problematic as time goes on. They might genuinely kind of engage with that. Like you said, you can't really control that. What would you recommend to parents that are doing that with later stage kids that have more of the that programming, right? They're already been traumatized.
Yeah. I have heard stories like that. It's very heartbreaking. And some people in my community, they're older, you know, it's kind of the opposite of what we normally assume. They are more progressive and their adult children are more fundamentalists. Yeah. And I think that's it's a very difficult place to be at. But I guess I don't see a way of, I think to avoid hypocrisy, we have to say that, our children get to make decisions for themselves. I think part of giving our kids freedom is the risks that they will choose things that are harmful for them. And we, as parents, I think we make ourselves vulnerable to that if we truly give them the autonomy. So, I mean, I think it would depend. I think if you were the one that exposed your kids to that teaching, then I think there's really an opportunity to basically repent and ask for forgiveness and to say that, listen, I'm the one that raised you and I'm the one that exposed you to this and I have changed my mind. I now see, I think there's room for the explanation, especially for older kids. You can have those kinds of conversations. And I think just being very honest about the mistakes that you've made, and then showing them the process of why you change your mind. This is how I discovered that this is toxic. This is how I find that it hurts people of color or gay people or whatever, that drove you away from that toxicity, and say, listen, I don't want you to hurt other people, and to compel them, right? From autonomous human being to autonomous human being, and try to persuade them. I mean, I think I'm trying to persuade people all the time. I don't evangelize people, but I do try to persuade and compel. And I think that that's maybe the way that we have to engage with our kids. But it's honestly not been my experience, thankfully. So I feel like I'm speaking a little bit outside of my lane, but I guess if I try to imagine myself in that position, I can only be consistent, right, in my fundamentalist
No,
principles
absolutely.
if I make space for the freedom for them to make decisions that I don't agree with.
Yeah.
But
It's a
it's
really
very
hard
hard.
dynamic when you're
Mm-hmm.
working with, I'm all inclusive and my kid wants to be part of an exclusive group. How do I include that? Like, what do I do with that dynamic? How do we
Yeah.
engage with that? It suddenly becomes a very, complex thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want my
But
kids to
I
be
like to
autonomous and they're
believe,
giving that up but
yeah.
yeah.
But I like to believe that parents still is a huge influence in most
Mm,
children, even adolescents' life. And so I don't, I think that that's kind of a fear that people have. It certainly was my fear as well. That, I knew that the best way my kids could rebel against me is to choose fundamentalism, right? But I
mm,
do feel like that fear is sometimes blown out of proportion. I feel like we should trust that we have influence on our kids, especially if we have treated them with respect and dignity. I feel like that's much more, you command respect when you respect the other person, right?
yeah.
And so hopefully you respect your child and they are willing to respect you in return. And in that way, your voice will matter more to them
Mm,
than some of the other voices that's speaking to them.
yeah. And then I guess as well, talking about kids that are slightly older, I mean, we all deconstruct in our own time and whatever that looks like. But for some parents, they are deconstructing with kids that are older that have been brought up with a very different model. I mean, out of the best of hearts, I think of someone like my dad, out of the best of hearts with no other understanding of how to parent, he gave us a good walloping frequently, it felt frequently as a kid. I'm sure it wasn't that frequent
Yeah.
action, but there was a bent over wooden spoon, whatever. I think I got belt a couple of times. I don't know if I did actually or whatever. I can't remember I won't put that on my dad, but that's all he knew. Right. And
Yeah.
I imagine if he had deconstructed when I was 15, 16 and had come to me and gone, hey, like, I'm sorry. I'm kind of like whatever. 15-year-old me would have been an asshole to my dad. He would not have been forgiving. He would have not been understanding. He would have not gone, okay, well, let's start over. I was pretty set in stone of like, oh, my parents are the worst, whatever by that point. I mean, is there, how do parents go about that kind of shift and dynamic as well? Like, what is the way that you engage a kid that because kids, generally speaking, do quite like a bit of stability on the whole. And for a parent to suddenly go through this change, I know that a lot of times it's not a sudden change, but by the time you figure out how you are going to be engaging with your kids, maybe you've been sitting on the fence going, I don't know how to do this. And suddenly you come across maybe Parenting Forward, or you come across your unfundamentalist group on Facebook and you go, oh gosh, this is it. Okay. Now I have a model. I'm going to start applying it. Like, is that something that works? Is that something that doesn't work? How do people navigate that? How do you set expectations for how you're going to go about these changes with kids?
I mean, I think we can look to like divorced families, right? That's a very profound and practically speaking. I mean, all of a sudden you're living in one home and the kids are living in two homes. Right? Like that's a very profound shift in the kids' lives. But we now see lots of examples of kids thriving right through that transition. So it sounds like it's a really hard and impossible thing to do, but it's quite possible. Kids are very resilient. They are able to adapt to changes. Look at the way that kids are responding to this pandemic. Their lives are totally upset. Their schools are all of a sudden online. They're having to go on lockdown. And they just adapt. Some of them, I think, quite better than adults, quite a bit better than adults. And so I would just say, I think kids can handle it. They are able to manage your transition and your shifting. I think that honesty is really important. I think you have to be honest and let your kids know that what's been going on and what's going on. But also, love and belonging, those two very important pillars of family life. And I agree with you. I think kids need a lot of security and stability. But that stability is the stability of love, right? So like,
Mm.
if we want to talk about divorced parents, it's like a lot of parents, they divorce, but they tell their kids, hey, we're getting divorced. This is a decision that we've made between us, but we still love you, right? That's always the addendum. And because that's really what's the most important thing. If the kids know that they're still loved, then it's almost like it can conquer all things, right? They can weather a lot of changes. Not to say that we don't still give them resources to help them with those transitions, but those resources are out there. And so yeah, I I would say definitely make it a priority to provide that love and belonging to your kids. And then when it comes to the shifting, I talk about the importance of sharing our faith shifting stories. I think it's really important because, like I mentioned, it's important for kids to know that they can also change their minds and they can also navigate their faith as they grow. But I think it's really important to be conscious of the space that your mind and state is at when you share those stories. So you don't share in the heat of the moment. You share when you're in a place of when you're more stable and you have set up resources for yourself. So other adults or therapists or spiritual advisors who are receiving sort of the brunt of your anxieties and reactions, so that when you do speak to your child, it's out of a space of lovingly sharing your story and this just frank honesty and a desire to share who you are with your children. I think that's very different from, let me tell you about how betrayed I felt by the church and how hurt I am. And because, when you do that, you make your children feel like they're responsible for your wounds. And that's quite unfair to them. I think you have to let them know this is not your responsibility. I experienced these hard times, but this is not on you. I have people who are helping me. You don't have to worry about me. But I want to tell you about these hard times that I went through because I want you to know me. I want you to know my story. And I want you to know that if you struggle, that you're not alone. And basically sort of to humanize yourself, right? Because I think a lot of kids don't realize their parents are also humans.
I had no concepts of my parents being humans until very late. Very, very late. Like, they were like, they never flinched. Nothing ever was wrong. You peel back the layers and people were dying left, right, and center. And it's just crazy, just people were ill and whatever. But it was always like, it's okay. We're fine. You're going to be fine. Like, no emotion shown. No, and you're like, whoa, like they really felt the need on some level to protect us from, their humanity, their ups and their downs. And that's had a profound, negative impact on me. There's been positives that have come from that and grown through that. But that is huge. And I guess you're talking about that as though, sharing your faith journey with your kids and going, hey, that's, this is how I've handled it. This is what's going on. It's not on you. I've got people to help me. Don't feel you need to look after me or anything. That from the other side, I can go, yes. Okay, great. But you and I both know the process of this can be years sometimes. I've talked to people that are 10 years in and still hurt and really angry and not sure how to funnel that emotion and probably do take it out on their kids at times or whatever. And they don't have community anymore. It's gone. And they don't know how to recreate community. They're struggling to figure out how to recreate community, and they don't have a therapist because, I don't know, maybe they're still holding on to an old belief that therapy's evil and you should only talk to pastors or whatever, even though they hate pastors or, got all this stuff going on. Do they do a my parents and kind of just go, brave face, don't show that I am struggling? How do people in the midst of it all, spiritually guide their kids? Do they go, okay, well, we'll act as though we're at stage 1 before I had a meltdown and just kind of while I'm figuring it out, just act as though nothing's changed spiritually and allow them to kind of go through that? Or is there the, hey, I'm changing, I'm trying to figure out, a bit like what you're talking about there, kind of from the other side, but I'm struggling, but I'm figuring that out. Don't worry, it's not your responsibility. How do you go about that in a lengthy period of time where it's not just that was a blip in the radar? This could be, I mean, when you're looking at kids, you've only got them for, 15 years if they're kind of school age years.
Yeah.
You could be 3/4 of that,
I do think that between parents and non-parents who are going through the same deconstruction process, of course, it's always impossible to compare two humans going through this process. It's so unique. But let's just, for the sake of comparison, I think if you're a parent, you're going to have to speed it up a little bit more for reasons that you've said, because the child growing up in front of you, time is not stopping for them. And so I do find that parents who are going through this, you have to remember, we said deconstruction is just figuring stuff out. You have to figure stuff out a little bit quicker because you're forced to confront, well, what do I say? What do I believe? What do I want to pass on? And I mean, that's just the responsibility of a parent. You chose to have kids. So that's just your reality. And I think in a way it's try to embrace it as a good thing in your life. Like you have to, kind of like you have to grow up a little bit faster because you're a parent.
Well, everyone I know, if that is go in the midst of that season, if you could say, hey, here's a pill, you can take it and it will speed this up. It will cut the time in half. I don't know anyone that wouldn't go, okay, hit me up. I'll take that. And so the idea of like, oh, well, like, because you have kids, you're probably going to go through this faster. I'm like, oh God, that sounds like a big silver lining to having kids. Big time.
Yeah. I mean,
you have experienced that as well, that you would say that on the whole, people that do have kids that are maybe younger, that may be looking to them for spiritual guidance, they do tend to do that. It's not just that they should and hopefully do.
Right. I do feel like, because parents will ask questions about, well, for example, let's say this idea of sin, right? Like they're not, because you know how it's scary to let go of doctrines that you grew up with. So I can see that this parent is struggling with letting go of this doctrine. They're afraid to say something like, there is no sin, you're not a sinful person. Like that sounds too radical for them. But at the same time, they've got this 3-year-old or 5-year-old saying, I have sin in my heart. And they instinctively and intuitively know that this is not what they want for their child to feel that way. And so all of a sudden, they're going to have to get there a little bit faster. They're going to have to let go of that doctrine and deconstruct it faster because this is a problem that's confronting them right now. This tender child in front of them receiving this doctrine. So in that way, like in this specific incident, I feel like, this is going to speed up your deconstruction. You're going to have to let go. And as hard as it is, and I understand that it is hard, but to me, somebody who's gone through it and looking back, it's not a bad thing.
Right. No.
Letting go of that quickly is not a bad thing. Letting go of something toxic faster. In fact, how many of us wish that we would have let go of some of the toxicity we held on to for too long faster?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So that is, I guess, a perk of parenting while deconstructing.
Wow. It makes me, I do research with the deconstruction community where we've got a huge kind of pool of people that we're doing research on. And it makes me, I'm suddenly in the back of my head, I'm going, oh, that's a metric we should measure. We should have a look at this because we're doing long-term as well as short-term research. So we're looking at over 10 years, 5 years, like who deconstructs more quickly than others. Is it certain groups of people? Is it certain types of people? It'd be really fascinating to throw in, are your parent, what age are your kids? And then have a measure of that, of like, go, whoa, people that have young kids deconstruct quicker than people that aren't, people that are single or people that have grown up kids or whatever. It'd be really fascinating.
Yeah, but then you have the factor of what we talked about is a lot of young families, they might hold on to the traditional churches because they provide better child support.
Right. Yeah.
So there's that factor. And then you wonder, did they stay longer because they have that built-in community and all the activities and the resources that's there? So there's just so many factors.
I talked to one of my good friends I was with earlier in the year over in America, and his wife is part of a mega church, and she still holds on to her faith, and and he has deconstructed, and they've got a very young child, and the child goes along to church with the mother, and I was asking, like, what's your thoughts on that? And he's like, I think it's great. I really want my kids to be around that kind of environment, because there is like these great resources, obviously, but also I want the child to learn that's a belief, and daddy doesn't believe that, mommy does, and we can have different ideas and different beliefs, and what do you believe, and talked about that. But do you have thoughts on how to navigate? I mean, some people, like, this isn't just a nice thing. This is able to get by in life thing. You know, the church provides services like childcare and different things that allow the parents to work, to be able to pay bills, to eat. You know, I mean, for a lot of people, this is like actually, you know, the line. How do you see people navigating that well in certain ways? How to keep hold of, like, maybe access to these resources, but bringing up their kids well? I guess it touches on maybe going to Christian schools and things like that as well. How do you have conversations with kids about that? Like, because, you know, there is, I know we talked about the parents having a great deal of influence on children, but there's a lot of data out there that says that it's quite a weak influence at times, for children compared to peers, compared to other components, right? So they go to a missionary school or a Christian school, and their peers have a big weight on them. And if all their peers are going, oh yeah, you're a sinner, or your mom's a sinner, or whatever, I don't know, that's going to do some stuff. Like, how do you recommend people engage with these kind of resources, whether they have to or if they don't have to? Is it advisable to use those and just write the child around it?
Like everything else, there are so many factors to take into consideration. So the story of the child who came home saying that I have sin in my heart, that family is in the situation that you described. This school and this childcare is really critical to their family, and the kid loves it. They love being there, and they're happy. And so I think what I said to them was, there's this fear of toxic teaching taking root in a child's heart. But there's also a lot of ways that you can combat that, right? And I think, like the dad that you're referring to, they're like, oh, I want my child to know this is a belief. Yeah, I actually think it's really important to be literate in, like, Bible stories and the culture. In fact, I think that a child who understands the culture really well is less likely to fall prey to it in, like, their impressionable years in adolescence. I don't know if you've heard of this idea of love bombing.
Okay.
Yeah. So when they encounter the love bombing, they might look a little bit deeper into some of the motivations of why all of a sudden this community is showering them with a lot of love and attention. And so I think so I call them spiritual child protection policies. I think there are ways that we can help a child be protected from some of the abusive spiritual teaching. So number one is really expose them to lots of other beliefs. So in this family, with where the mom and the dad have different beliefs, that's really good, because the child, it interrupts their indoctrination, right? Like, they're receiving this teaching from school, but they also are receiving other teachings. And that's huge in just letting them know that there's not just one normal, and there's not just one universal way of thinking about life, that there's other ways. And they can begin to navigate multiple stories from a very young age. I think that's very good. It's a way to protect anyone from being steeped in one ideology, right? The danger of a single story. And so there's that. And then there's just a very direct combating that particular toxic teaching. So helping them understand that, okay, you heard this, it's wrong. That you can love your teacher, and that your teacher can be a good and kind human being, but still be wrong. Like, that's very important for kids to learn. So I think there are ways that you can still access that resource, especially if all else is going well and it's working for your family. Yeah. You don't necessarily have to pull them out of that environment, that there are other ways to ensure that your child thrives.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. And I guess this brings me to another point that I guess is huge, and I'm sure you've come across because it's really common, is that not everyone deconstructs with the rest of their immediate family. And so I'm sure you've come across couples where one partner is still in many ways ingrained in fundamentalism and the other partner has deconstructed, deconverted, whether they've done that openly with their partner or not, because that's a whole kettle of fish how to go about that. But for whatever reason, they are still together. They are in very different places. That's a huge tension in how are we raising these kids? Like, do you have kind of advice that you give people going through this? What are some kind of common kind of dynamics at play that you would recommend kind of engaging with?
Yeah. This is common. I don't know if it's very common, I have to say, but it is common because I think, right, if you are in, well, okay, I'm not going to make any judgments about people's relationships, but I think I can just give some advice about people who are deconstructing alongside their partner. I think we have to understand what I think you and I understand, which is that everyone goes through it differently and under a different timeline. And I think, right, mutual respect is to give your partner that freedom to not kind of force them to come alongside your journey in the same speed and way that you are. I know that was temptation for me. Like I wanted my partner to really shift at the same pace and in the same way as me. And it just didn't happen because he's a different person with different responses and reactions and different triggers. And of course there's, I'm married to a man. So there's different messaging, right? Different versions of toxicity that comes at a woman and at a man. And so just really making space and respecting each other's process, I think goes a long ways in going through this journey together. Yeah. And then when it comes to parenting, that's a really tough one. I feel like all couples, whether or not you're deconstructing, have to make some compromises. And it just takes some communication to get on the same page, to respond to the children in, sort of a more unified fronts, because you don't want to be too inconsistent, right? But at the same time, I do think that our kids are resilient enough to contain right? Different personalities. And I even tell them, I was like, you have to understand. And I mean, kids know this. They know that they go to mom to ask for certain things. They go to dad to ask for another thing because they know who they can get away with, right? With what? Yeah. So in that example, you can see our children's resilience at navigating multiplicity of ideas and perspectives. And so to not be afraid of being who you are, being the different human beings that you are. Having said that, I do think there are some deal breakers. I think that if, for instance, recently somebody told me that their partner who hasn't deconstructed and he's deconstructed, that she's wanting to take the kids to church, and he feels like it's not safe with the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's something that's kind of a deal breaker. This concerns my children's well-being and health, and I'm not going to compromise on that, right? So you have to kind of pick your battles, right?
Sure.
So that's a battle you might want to fight and put your foot down and say, no, you cannot take my children to church because it might be a super spreader event.
Yeah.
Right. But then there are maybe other things that you can compromise on and say, okay, yeah, I'm okay if you take them to this Bible study that I totally don't agree with, provided that I want to be able to say, I want to be able to have input into my children's spirituality as well. So yeah, it just depends on so many circumstances and factors, how you want to approach parenting from different spectrums of theology and faith.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense. And the harm, I mean, that example is a great example because it's a very clear physical risk, you know, where people's different beliefs about that are. But if we're going to believe what scientists are telling us of how things spread, church, not a great place to go if you're wanting to avoid COVID right now. So you can see a very physical risk, but I guess if you take a step back and go, okay, what about other risks? I mean, the trauma of being told that you're going to burn for trillions of years if you don't believe right, or tick this box, or, you know, whatever, behave well, as a young kid. That's a very real, damaging thing as well, depending on how different people see it. Obviously, if you're fundamental, you're not going to see it that way, but, and so then,
I agree, but you have to also, and I mean, this is hard for me to admit too, to myself, because I was really harmed by that teaching, but you have to admit that there are kids who come through that without harm.
Yeah.
They seem to be able to just shake it off and be like, that was just a silly thing my Sunday school teacher said, and I'm okay. Right. Yeah. They don't experience trauma, even though. Absolutely. And so I think that's where you have to really kind of understand your child and like watch out for signs, for red flags. Like, is this something that's traumatizing your child? Or is it something that you're going to be able to help them through and give them the resources and the information for them to come through this without trauma? But yeah, there are risks. It's a risk, right? But, you know, life is not without risks. And we have to make these parenting decisions that weigh those risks. But I agree with you that spiritual trauma is not any less damaging than physical harm, like exposure to COVID. And I think that's a really good point. And we should think of it in that way, because I think mental health is just as important as physical health. But I think being conscious of that is, right, it's half the job. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and it is a big battle to have with someone. Yeah. Just like the person that doesn't believe that COVID is a risk and therefore they want to take their kids to church. Most people in the church, certainly, that are going along to church every Sunday, don't believe that teaching hell is a risk or a bad thing. So that's a whole battle to win first. Just like you might want to pick the battle of the COVID issue, I think you very well, it could be a deal breaker. It's like, no, I do not want my child to go to this church where I can see that she is internalizing the shame from this spiritually traumatic teaching. And that's a deal breaker for you. So yeah, it's hard. I don't envy people in that situation. And I hope that I can be of support to them. But I just want to recognize that it's not an easy road to walk if you and your partner are deconstructing at different paces, or if you really land at drastically different spaces. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to navigate. I talked to tons of people going through that, and the dynamic of having kids on top of that is just a whole other world, especially when people from a fundamental background do approach children much more as possessions. I know they wouldn't like that language, but it's basically it still ties back to the old beliefs that were in the Bible, where women are property, children are property. That's how we see them. They do what we want. We control them. There's, even if that would never be articulated, that's still kind of how we're perceiving or building or framing things. And so there is a dynamic that you're coming up against someone who is going, no, they are my responsibility. They're my property. I want to make sure they're indoctrinated, as you say. That's a good thing for me. I want that. And so that's a real battle, like, to be facing. I can't even imagine the dynamic of, and then you're a passionate mom or dad who's going, this is my kid. I don't want him to be hurt or harmed in any way, physical, spiritual, emotional. That's a huge thing to navigate. It's massive. Yeah. So thank you. That's really good. So I imagine early on you go into this space and you're like, okay, we need to create some community. We need to create some resources here for people that are going through these radical evolutions, devolutions of faith and spirituality, in how to parent. Has the landscape changed since you kind of got in there? Is there more stuff for people going through this? Because, I mean, there is no shortage of people leaving the church, deconstructing, redefining their faith, shifting to progressive movements. Like, is there more stuff coming out? Are there more communities developing? Are there, church communities that are maybe more progressive that are providing these kind of children's care? Like, is that changing, or does it still feel very kind of sparse and tumbleweed?
Well, you told me that 30 people recommended me.
Yeah, well, right? It does say that there's not many other than you.
So, I mean, I don't know how to feel about that. On the one hand, I'm happy that people know that this is what I provide. On the other hand, it does make me wonder, why aren't more people doing this work? Yeah. I have to say that there continues to be more and more resources for parenting in a progressive way. And I rely on those communities a lot for providing my community with resources. So you've got lots of gentle and peaceful parenting, decolonizing parenting. You've got parents who are engaging children as real human beings. Like, I think that's constantly progressing and evolving, and that's fantastic. And I really connect with those communities. But I have to say, there still is very little resources for parents who are going through this particular brand of deconstruction from evangelicalism, who are parenting. I still don't see a ton of resources in this space. And so I'm continuing to create them. Like I think I told you, I'm running this Parenting After Purity Cultures conference. So it's like, there are people talking about deconstructing from purity culture. There are people who are talking about parenting with sex positivity, but there's not a lot on that intersection, right?
Sure, yeah.
And so that's kind of where I really want to speak into, because I know it's different. It's a little bit different, right? Wanting to parent our kids in a sex positive way is great, but how do you do that when you still have those stories inside of your head from your upbringing? I think it's just a different experience. And so that's kind of what I want to speak into. So I don't want to say that there hasn't been any progress. I think there has been, and I think there are, continuing to be books and resources out there. But at the same time, it does still kind of feels like I don't have a lot of competition.
Yeah, well, it's a good problem for you, or a good thing for you, I guess. But it's remarkable to me. You look at the stats of how many people are going into this and coming out of fundamentalism. It's literally thousands every day just in America alone. Never mind worldwide. And you're going to look at the data on just who has kids. You're talking a vast percentage of people on the planet. And so you can only assume that lots of these people have kids and are going to be asking these questions, looking for resources. It really does astound me. But I wasn't really aware of my lack of knowledge of this part of, deconstruction and that world as well. And so I guess maybe it's not on the tips of everyone's or the forefronts of everyone's thinking. I don't know, but I'm grateful that there are people like you that are creating resources and putting stuff out there, and something like sex positivity and changing it. I mean, that's huge. Like, I talk to people that have not believed in God for 20 years. I talked to a woman who I think she was in her late 50s, and she hadn't believed in God in over 20 years. And she said she was in the shop and she was looking at an outfit and she thought, I'd love to wear that. And then she had this thought of I could never wear it though. What would people think? That would be so immodest. God would be so, she didn't believe in God, and she still got this stuff. And she said also it was the furthest thing from an immodest outfit, if there is such a thing anyway. You know what I mean? She's in her late 50s or something, she was saying, she's probably not looking for I don't know, a boob tube and a miniskirt or whatever, kids are told they're not allowed to wear. So it's deeply ingrained. So even as we progress out to have tools and resources helping us navigate that so we can help our kids navigate, it's just so huge. And especially with Tina, have you come across Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers?
Yes.
She's fantastic.
I've heard of her.
But she told me when I had her on podcast, she says it's the number one metric that they've come across for, do kids have a healthy relationship with their parents once the kids become adults? The number one metric was, did their parents talk with them throughout their childhood about sex?
Really?
The number one metric. If you want to have a great relationship with your kids when they become adults, make sure you're talking about sex throughout their childhood, from early age right through. Isn't that crazy?
That is mind-blowing.
I have no idea what the data point for that is. If you ever want to quote it or something, you have to ask her what that comes from. But it blew my mind, because I was like, no, I guess it makes sense. But I was like, whoa, would never have guessed it. And so, you know, a great point of you creating a conference like that is massive for parents, because they want to have a great relationship with their kids. And who doesn't want to have a great relationship with your kids your whole life, you know? And that's one of the main ways you're going to do it. Make sure you don't bring in your weird purity bullshit from your past life, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that dies at the door and you bring in some healthy stuff. Yeah, no, thank you. So how can people, because we need to wrap up, but how can people engage with this stuff? The Purity Culture Conference, is that all online, or is kind of?
Yes, it's on, it will be. I haven't announced it yet, so there's no details out yet, but you can go to parentingforwardconference.com and access my 2 other conferences. Those are all still for sale. And you can join my Facebook group at Raising Children Unfundamentalist. And you can find me on social. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can look for Cindy Wang Brandt or Parenting Forward. So both of those things are me.
Perfect. And do you have a preference, or do you not really mind how people connect with you? Because I can probably link one or the other for...
I feel like most people come to me through Raising Children Unfundamentalist on Facebook. So
okay, I'll make sure there'll be a whole bunch of links in your show notes. There'll be just a spew of them, but like that might be where you want to go first. That sounds great. Amazing. Yeah. Well, and please let me know when that conference is live as well, in case I miss it, because I'd love to let people know as well.
That would be great.
And at some point, when I'm a parent, I'll be able to go, oh man, I need to be like listening to your podcast, your books. Maybe I need to read your book anyway, though. We did talk about that. So maybe I'll pick up a copy. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been really great.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like we could have like gone in 100 different directions, but I love the stuff we talked about, and maybe we'll have you on again at some point in the future, and we can go in some other directions. Maybe I'll field a whole bunch of questions for you, and we can pick your brain or something.
That would be fun. That would be fun. Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, and have a good day. Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of time left in your day, so
yeah.
All right.
All right.
Love you, Cindy. I'll catch you there. All right. Bye.